Welcome to Ride High Cowboy, the podcast that brings you the true crimes of Wyoming. So without further ado, let's saddle up and take a historical ride through the Old West. Green River, Wyoming was established in 1868 as an end-of-the-rail Union Pacific Railroad town. Another hell on wheels dot on the map with wild women, itchy trigger fingers, and a lot of sin. After years of fur trapping, the railroad brought in a host of new arrivals to the area, ready to work hard and play hard. But throughout the years, it seemed that the Hell on Wheels name may have fallen off, but the Wild West was still holding strong. Edward Woodson was a black janitor for the Union Pacific Railroad, originally from Omaha, Nebraska. He was a husband and a father trying to support his family any way he could. By 1918, he found himself working at the Green River train station. It had been 3 months since he began life in Green River, but by December of that year, his life would be upended in ways he never would have imagined. It was a cold morning on December 10th. Edward sat down at the meal counter located at the train depot. Evelyn Ware, the white waitress that morning, took his order. When she returned with a plate of cornmeal mush, Edward became angry. He said he had ordered sausages. Evelyn, a woman who'd take no gruff from the railroaders she'd dealt with for years, sternly asserted that she didn't hear him, and according to her later testimony, Edward responded by calling her a liar. By Evelyn's own account, she then grabbed 3 heavy salt shakers from another table and smashed them into the face of Edward. She then yelled at Edward that, quote, "It's bad enough to take abuse from white men, but I wouldn't take it from a," end quote. You can fill in the blank of her description of Edward's skin color. She then told him to get up and get out, and that she wouldn't wait on him any further. At that point, another man in the restaurant, N.E. Miller, who was a switchman with the railroad and had also been a part of the group of men brought in 3 months prior, stood up and assisted Edward in leaving the establishment. A few moments later, according to Evelyn, Edward returned again to the counter of the restaurant and placed his order with the head waitress whose section he'd just sat in. N.E. Miller then told Evelyn, in her own words, that she shouldn't come back to the restaurant due to Edward having a gun. But Mr. Miller assured her that though she had nothing to worry about and that he himself wouldn't be afraid of Edward even if he had 20 guns. As Edward made his way outside the restaurant, N.E. Miller followed him out the door. A few moments later, a shot rang out as loud as the trains pulling into the station. Ethel Harris, a cashier at the Union Pacific Hotel, sat quietly eating her breakfast at the counter of the restaurant. She heard a commotion and looked over to see a waitress throwing something at a black man seated with a plate of food in front of him. Ethel then watched Mr. Curtis, a Pacific Union switchman, and Mr. Miller get up, grab the black man by the arms, and remove him from the restaurant. Mr. Miller then came back in and conversed with Ethel as she finished her breakfast. Mr. Curtis then came back in, and the 2 men made plans to head back to their shared room. As the 2 exited the restaurant, a moment of silence as the door swung shut. Then Ethel heard 3 loud booms that she later described as gunshots. She stated in her testimony later that she knew it had been the black man that shot, because when she saw him enter the restaurant the second time, he had sat only 3 seats down from her at the counter, and she noticed a gun in his coat pocket. George Lemons, another switchman for the railroad, entered the restaurant around 10:30 a.m. He shivered off the cold as he stepped through the door. As Mr. Miller and Edward walked out, George sat down and ordered eggs and toast. He settled in to wait for his food that arrived surprisingly quickly. George stated that she, referring to the waitress, Ed said she was getting enough brawling out from the white people and would not stand for it from a black man. She then told Edward to get out of there and not to come back. Said a few moments after he had started eating, Edward walked back in and sat down about 8 or 9 stools down from him. He clarified that the waitress who asked him to leave did not wait on him this time. George Miller and Curtis all made their way towards the door, chatting with Ethel as Curtis began to open the door. Before he could swing it open, gunfire erupted. Curtis tried to grab for the gun, but a shot hit Miller and he fell to the ground. Edward shot again as the man lay dying on the ground, then raised the gun and started shooting at George. George quickly tied a handkerchief around Miller's arm to stop the bleeding. In the chaos, Edward ran towards the lumber yard down the road, and George tried to follow, but soon ran out of breath. His intent was to grab a gun and kill him for what he'd done to his friend. He went 3 different places looking for one, but to no avail. Someone yelled to George to call the sheriff, but as he was still searching for a firearm, he told another man to run and get them. The sheriffs were quick to act and quicker to find Edward and arrest him. Edward Woodson had left the restaurant when Curtis and Miller so kindly escorted him from the restaurant. He then walked to his quarters and sat for a brief moment before grabbing his Colt .45 revolver and returned to finish his breakfast. As he finished his meal and walked to the door of the restaurant, his mind was filled with rage. He then turned and shot Miller twice in the chest, killing him. He shot Curtis once in the wrist during the struggle. Curtis walked away from the horrific scene with only his one injury. Local physician Dr. J.W. Hawk explained that he had examined Miller and described that 2 gunshot wounds, one in the left breast and one 4 inches over his heart, were the cause of death. Both bullets lodged in the body with no exit wound. Both wounds would have proven fatal on their own, and therefore the kill shot was not clearly noted. Two Union Pacific special agents, John Gale and Matt McCourt, were sitting in their office at the train station. UP special agents were fully empowered law enforcement officers of the time, akin to police or sheriffs. They held the same authority as any other law enforcement agency, and then some. Matt had heard the shots ring out and rushed to his window to see what was going on. To his shock, he saw a man running up the street with a big gun in his hand. Matt grabbed John and they raced after the man, who they were able to apprehend at the lumber yard a few blocks down the road. Matt stated in his testimony that, quote, "He was coming towards me and I saw the gun in the front pocket of his pants. I put my hand up to him and pulled my gun. He pulled his gun and then said, 'All right, that's enough,' and walked over and handed it to me. I said to him, 'Come on with us,' and there were 4 or 5 men behind us and I hurriedly brought him up to the jail. And during the time we were bringing him up, he never spoke. We turned him over to the sheriff and he was put in the county jail." End quote. When asked if Edward had been known to have a, quote, quarrelsome nature, Matt stated that, quote, "I have never heard of him being in any fight. I think he was a little quick-tempered at times." End quote. Sheriff Frank Kidd was now staring at a black man in handcuffs being escorted to him by 2 UP special agents. Sheriff Arthur Dixon stood by his side as they accepted the prisoner being handed over to them. As they escorted him into the jail, they contemplated how to handle this. They knew that since Edward was a black man who had shot and killed a white man, there would be a riot. They needed to keep Edward safe until they could try him for his crimes. Frank stated in his testimony that as they got inside, they saw the mob forming down the street. He asked someone to come inside and lock the door as the yelling outside became louder. Arthur stated that they needed to get rid of Edward, and the two sheriffs decided to lock him in the basement for his own safety. Frank stated, quote, "We put him in the basement, and I got him down into the coal bin and told him to stay there, because if those fellows had got him, they might hang him. Edward said, it is just as well now as any time," end quote. Frank continued, quote, "They would not have found him if he had stayed where I told him to. But there is a light hanging right over the boiler, and he came out and stood right under this light. And someone must have looked through the window, and they went down and got him, and I never saw him after until he was hanging on the pole in front of the depot," end quote. Frank testified that he hadn't recognized a single person in the mob that came for Edward. Arthur provided more detail to the story in his testimony. He said that he and Frank took Edward to the building's coal bin in the basement to keep him out of the hands of the mob, which he estimated to number 400 or 500. He said he tried to put the mob off by letting 4 of them to go through the jail to confirm he wasn't there, but they pushed right in on us. Frank also claimed that he hadn't recognized anyone in the mob. Attorney T.S. Taliaferro was at the courthouse when the mob pulled Edward from the jail. He tried to call out and calm down the infuriated crowd of people, but to no avail. His screams fell silent as the angered townspeople took their revenge. Edward was strung up from the light pole and hung there until the Rock Springs, Wyoming coroner could arrive to the site. But as soon as the body stopped moving, the townspeople calmed and returned to their day as though nothing had happened. Edward's cause of death was noted by Coroner Joseph Joinson as, quote, "hanging by an unknown mob," end quote. Though Sweetwater County Attorney Fred W. Johnson said he would call a grand jury to investigate who had a hand in the lynching and will probe the matter to the fullest extent, no one was ever charged in Edward Woodson's lynching. The Green River Star newspaper reported that, quote, "The popularity of the two switchmen brought about the high trend of excitement that existed, and the cold-blooded manner in which the deed was done made it utterly impossible to save the Negro murderer from the infuriated mass of humanity that surrounded the jail. The officials, seeing that they had no time to get the Negro away, hid him as stated above. But when found by the crowd, no power could have saved him from these determined avengers of the death of their friend," end quote. According to an Ogden, Utah newspaper, as many as 25 black families fled Green River 36 hours after the lynching, fearing more violence and having been warned or even ordered to do so. They left all their belongings behind and left by train. Papers in Kemmerer and Sheridan, Wyoming, quickly picked up the story. But in the same issue, the Ogden Evening Standard reported that Green River Mayor J.W. Hawk and Union Pacific Railroad officials emphatically denied any black families had left Green River, adding that, quote, "all race feeling, if there was such, ended with the lynching of the Negro Tuesday night," end quote, and the town had been quiet since. Census figures may in fact show that's what happened. In the decades between 1910 and 1920, while the population of nearby Rock Springs grew by nearly 12% and Sweetwater County by 40%, Green River's population shrank by 3.5%. The story of Edward Woodson is so open-ended. While not one witness or friend ever mentioned that Edward had a temper or was prone to violence, he clearly did on December 10th, 1918. His death at the time was just another lynching. While tragic, it wasn't out of the norm. Towns, though governed and regulated, were still subject to mob rule, and with the population so small, it was easy to get everyone riled up in the face of a problem. But because he was not allowed a trial for his sins, we will never know why he chose to murder a man and maim another. All we can do is speculate. The transcripts that I reference in this story were riddled with racial slurs. Due to this, many local historians like to rule this as a horrific result of blatant racism in Wyoming. And perhaps they're right. Wyoming has had its fair share of racial riots throughout its inception. However, most of those riots were based on available work and labor unions. Lynchings came in all colors, creeds, races, and religions in Wyoming. Cattle rustlers, murderers, rapists, thieves, and vandals all shared the end of the rope throughout Wyoming's history. Some of it was absolutely racially motivated, while others were merely a crime committed by a person who happened to not be white. Was Edward Woodson lynched because he was black, or because he shot a man in cold blood and fled the scene? Were there underlying tensions? Could the witnesses have allowed prejudice to sway their memories of the events that took place? We'll never know. All we have now are the transcripts of the witness statements of the events that took place that day, along with newspaper articles that were written to sell copies rather than always tell the full truth. And therein lies the problem of tracking down the true history of Wyoming. The story of our past is always told by the victor of the battle. The winning side determines how the events are told to the generations that come after. And when the losing side is no longer there to refute the story, we can only proceed with what we are told. I encourage everyone to do their research and never take anything at face value. The history of Wyoming is told as that of a state born of hardworking men and women who fought for their lives in the Wild West on the plains drenched in blood. The equality state that didn't own slaves and was the first to give women the right to vote. But those stories, while tied up in pretty packages with neat little bows, are often hiding the deadly truths of our birth as a state. While laws and government were firmly in place, the mob rule mentality often took justice into their own hands for what they believed to be the greater good, and the same government set in place to tether those beasts often looked the other way. I hope these stories inspire everyone to learn the true history of Wyoming, the state that has been and always will be the Wild West. Thank you for listening. I'm Blue, and this has been one of many stories from Ride High Cowboy.